Thanks very much, Jury, for that kind introduction. We're delighted to be here with you today to talk about bringing drugs to market in the US, FDA approval, pricing, and reimbursement considerations for innovators. We know Korea Bio and Korea Biotech innovators are having a real boom right now. And if we go to the agenda, we're going to really focus on a multidisciplinary approach today to help you understand the current environment at FDA and at CMS. And we really want to provide you with some of our latest thinking on drug approval, biologics approval in FDA for marketing in the US, and also get you to start thinking early about pricing and reimbursement, because it's never too early to do that. And there are a lot of changes that we'll talk about. I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves. Catherine?
Thank you so much, Becky. My name is Catherine Starks, and I'm a partner in Sidley's healthcare practice. My work covers a range of matters for life science companies with a focus on the interrelated issues of the anti-kickback statute, coverage and reimbursement, drug pricing, rebate reform, and market access. I work frequently with emerging life science companies as they prepare for launch and help them navigate the complex legal framework that impacts coverage, reimbursement, and pricing. Kelly?
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, my name is Kelly Cho. I'm an associate with Sidley's FDA regulatory team in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Seoul, Korea, and have a background in training in molecular biology. Here at Sidley, I advise clients on a wide range of FDA regulatory and compliance matters. I work on a variety of product types regulated by the agency, but focus on medical products, so drugs, devices, and biologics. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting us. I hope our webinar today will be somewhat useful and intriguing to many of you.
Thanks, Catherine and Kelly. And just a quick administrative reminder that we hope today's presentation will be interesting and informative, but of course it's not legal advice. We would be delighted to follow up with you if you have any specific questions, and our contact information can be found in the last slide. So let's start by focusing on the current environment at FDA. So as everybody knows, FDA has a public health mission, and it has been designated by Congress as the entity that decides whether drugs and biologics can be marketed in the US. And FDA takes a risk-based approach to that project. It looks at the potential benefits of the therapeutic versus the potential risks, and also quality issues. And it always considers important scientific issues, legal issues, policy issues as part of its approach. You may not know, but FDA actually regulates about 20 to 25% of the US economy. And it's not only drugs and biologics, but also medical devices, food, dietary supplements, tobacco, veterinary products, cosmetics, and also radiation-emitting electronics. So it has quite a large portfolio. And FDA's offices, you'll see a picture of them there. My old office is right above the A in FDA, and they sit right outside of the Beltway in White Oak in Maryland. And we'll go to the next slide. FDA's leadership right now is, of course, in a significant time of transition, but there's also some continuity that's important to realize. The acting commissioner of Food and Drug is Janet Woodcock. She is a career veteran. She has been at FDA since 1984, incredibly well regarded, and is somebody who has served in a number of important roles at FDA. Until quite recently, she served in long stints as the director of CDER, which is, of course, the drug center at FDA. And she was recently named by the new Biden administration as the acting commissioner of Food and Drug. There's speculation about whether she might also be named as the permanent Senate confirmed commissioner of Food and Drug in the future, but the Biden administration has not yet said what they will do there. There's something called the Vacancy Act, which does put a limit on the period of time that senior officials can be in senior policy roles. But the speculation right now is that she's had so much experience with COVID. She was on Operation Warp Speed. Perhaps she will stay in an acting, if not a permanent capacity for some time, perhaps until COVID is more in the rearview mirror, but still to see. There's also been some important changes in the critical centers that regulate drugs and biologics. So CDER has gotten, in the recent past, a new director, Patrizia Cavazzoni, who is handpicked by Dr. Woodcock to be her successor, very well regarded scientist, medical doctor, somebody who's seen as a good problem solver. But that's a very significant change in CDER since Dr. Woodcock had been really at the helm of it for so many years. Continuity at CBER, the Biologics Center, where Dr. Marks, who's been in that position for a long time, you may recognize him because he's had a significant role in vaccine approvals and is a very well-respected oncologist by training and career official. So that's the senior leadership team at FDA. Another important anchor for any discussion about getting your products approved at FDA is to be aware of the 21st century cures environment that permeates FDA. When I was there a couple of years ago working with then Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, he talked about the 21st century cures mindset. This is a major piece of legislation from the US Congress, and it created some additional pathways for FDA to be more nimble and accelerated in how it approves drugs and biologics. The hope is to bring needed novel therapies to market more quickly without sacrificing the gold standard of safety and efficacy. Kelly's going to talk a little bit later about some of those programs that you can think about as you're navigating potential ways to get to market at FDA. But one important snapshot we wanted to bring you early on is that even during COVID, FDA has continued to approve novel therapies at a pace that really exceeds that pre-21st century cures environment, as reflected in those last few bars there. We'll go to the next slide. I also want to focus on emergency use authorization, EUAs. You may have heard a lot about this in the COVID environment. Probably before COVID, very few people had heard about it. This is an authority that allows FDA in extraordinary circumstances to allow marketing of a product without standard approval or clearance. So it's for unapproved products or unapproved uses of approved products when there's an emergency. And so here there has, in fact, as you know, been a declaration of a public health emergency. This is very focused on bringing COVID-related products to market more quickly in a limited and contained way. So the sponsor has to show that based on the totality of the scientific evidence, known and potential benefits outweigh the known and potential risks, considering the material threat that COVID places. It's also, there are defined standards for clinical data, and it's really available if there's no alternative, and it can be rescinded if the risk-benefit assessment changes. Another thing that's very important to keep in mind about EUAs is, unlike standard approvals and clearances, they're not open-ended, they're close-ended. So they will expire when the emergency declaration expires, when the COVID emergency is over. So just recently, at the end of April, the Secretary of Health and Human Services renewed the determination that a public health emergency exists, at least until July 20th of this year. The expectation, of course, is that they will continue to reevaluate that and align it so that they wouldn't close it before COVID is really in the rearview mirror. Under these EUA authorities, FDA has been very hard at work. So it has already allowed marketing by EUAs, as you know, for 3 vaccines in the US. And in terms of therapies to be used, typically these are therapies that were already on the market for some indication, but they would be then allowed to be marketed for an additional COVID-related indication. That's 9 times. Diagnostics have been much broader, over 300. A lot of these are personal protective equipment and so forth. And a lot of these sponsors have announced that they're in the process of also, in parallel to this, getting their products into the standard approval and clearance pathways so that once the public health emergency is over, they can still be marketed there. So that's another thing to keep in mind. This is not a generally available authority to be used. It's really specific to the COVID response. I want to turn it over to Catherine. And as we talked about a little bit at the beginning, sometimes innovators are properly very focused on navigating FDA, navigating approval, and sometimes they wait until relatively close to marketing to start thinking about pricing and reimbursement. But as Catherine's going to explain, the environment's really changing, and it's important to be aware of that early on as an innovator.
Thank you so much, Becky. That's exactly right. If you are a clinical stage company, it is really important to monitor this space and these issues because they're governed by a complicated regulatory landscape and are very critical to your product's commercial success. In the United States, right now, we're in a state of flux when it comes to these issues. There's been considerable attention directed towards the issues of drug pricing, reimbursement, affordability, and access. And we're in a state of transition as changes in the political and regulatory landscape overlap with growing concern around a longstanding issue of patient affordability. Oftentimes, these issues have been addressed from several angles, including congressional action, executive order from the president, as well as agency regulations and even enforcement. We saw an uptick in changes in the very final days of the Trump administration, with a flurry of regulatory activity that is continuing to reverberate around the industry today. These changes included regulatory reforms that were intended to reduce the prices that the government is willing to pay for certain drugs, to bring more transparency to drug pricing, and in one instance, to really overhaul longstanding drug payment systems. Just to give a sense for this, the types of changes we saw in the final days of the Trump administration, I'll note that in November, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is often referred to as CMS, and is one of the agencies involved in setting rules for the coverage and reimbursement of pharmaceutical products, announced a most favored nations rule, which would tie payment for certain injectable and infused products to international prices for those products. For the drugs identified in the rule, CMS would pay no more than the lowest price that drug manufacturers receive for the product in similar countries. The rule is very controversial. It has been challenged in courts by industry trade organizations as well as manufacturers. Our firm is deeply involved in counseling clients on this rule, including from a litigation perspective. The rule is currently stayed until the outcome of the litigation is decided, so it's unclear whether the government will move forward with this model, but at the very least, the model and the rule show us that there's interest in reducing drug prices, and there's interest in referring to international prices as an area to help control spending on prescription drugs in the United States. Another controversial rule that we saw late last year came from the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, which finalized regulations that would overhaul long-standing drug payment systems by preventing pharmaceutical manufacturers from paying certain rebates to pharmacy benefit managers, also known as PBMs, for Medicare Part D prescription drug utilization. The agency's stated goal of that rule is to encourage lower list prices for pharmaceutical products and to reduce patient out-of-pocket spending on prescription drugs. This rule is also controversial. It has also been challenged in the courts, and core components of the rule have been subject to delay. If it's implemented, it will represent sweeping changes in the ways that drugs are paid for in the United States and accessed by beneficiaries. So it's another area to monitor. Finally, I'll note that there has been a shift towards value-based pricing in the United States, which means that payment and pricing for a drug is conditioned on the drug's performance and clinical outcomes. The movement towards value-based pricing has been discussed at length over the past decade, but it has started to pick up some more momentum recently with a new regulatory framework designed to support this type of payment structure. And we've seen a number of gene and cell therapy companies look really closely at these models, particularly for those products that offer curative treatments for otherwise chronic or expensive disease states. These are just a few examples of some of the pricing-related changes that we've seen in the last several months. There are others out there, many interrelated, but given the various litigation challenges we've seen, it's uncertain what the future might look like. Looking forward to future reforms, we've seen the Biden administration primarily focused on infrastructure in the first 100 days in office, with little discussion about drug pricing. However, there was a subtle shift in tone in Biden's address to Congress in late April, where he encouraged Congress to let Medicare, one of the primary payers for prescription drugs, to negotiate drug prices with pharmaceutical manufacturers, which the government currently does not have authority to do. Whether that will be accomplished has yet to be seen, but following the president's remarks, we've seen renewed focus from Congress on price negotiations between Medicare and drug manufacturers, including a possible legislative proposal that could tie Medicare Part D prices to an index based on international prices. In short, we are very much in a state of flux. The landscape today does not look like it did 6 months ago, and it may not be the same 6 months from now. If you are a clinical stage company, it's really critical to monitor these issues because they are so important to a product and a company's commercial success.
Well, thanks, Catherine. That's really important guidance on watching that environment as it continues to evolve. I want to bring in Kelly to focus us in on the FDA regulatory process for bringing new drugs and biologics to market. There are so many different steps. I think it'd be very helpful if you could sort of break it down, summarize it, and then we'll dive more deeply into some of the specific trends that we're seeing.
Sure, thank you, Becky. So the next slide provides a pictorial overview of FDA's drug approval process. As many of you are probably familiar with, on a very high level, companies would first conduct preclinical research, which would include in vitro and animal testing. Companies would then submit an investigational new drug application, or an IND, to FDA to initiate clinical studies. An IND generally goes into effect in 30 days, unless FDA initiates a clinical hold or notifies the sponsor before the 30 days lapse that the sponsor may go ahead and initiate studies. The sponsor would then conduct at least one clinical trial and ultimately submit a marketing application to FDA for approval. Before it reaches a decision on the application, FDA may turn to its advisory committees and may seek advice and recommendations. The agency, however, is not bound by that decision. NDAs, or new drug applications, are generally submitted for small molecule drugs, and biologics license applications, or BLAs, are generally submitted for vaccines, cell therapies, gene therapies, and tissue products. CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, generally has jurisdiction over small molecule drugs, and CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, has jurisdiction over biological products, with some exceptions. So we understand that foreign clinical trials and their acceptability by FDA are often a significant point of interest among companies that are seeking the most cost-efficient and effective ways to bring drugs to US market. FDA has a strong record of approving drugs based on pivotal clinical trials with a low percentage of subjects from the US. In fact, according to one study by IQVIA that looked at all drug and biological approvals between 2013 and 2017, among the 176 drug product approvals that occurred, 30 were approved based on pivotal trials with less than 10% of the patients from the US, and 55 drugs were approved based on pivotal trials with less than 20% of patients from the US. FDA has issued regulations and a guidance document on this topic, which I will touch briefly here. But as you will see, the overall goal of the agency is to assure that the safety, well-being, and rights of trial participants are protected, and assure that the trial quality is sufficient for the agency to review the data that arises from these trials. FDA permits sponsors to conduct foreign clinical trials with or without an IND. If conducted under an IND, the foreign clinical trial must meet all FDA regulations that would apply as if that study were conducted within the US. And there may be some advantages to filing an IND because sponsors may receive early agency feedback on important topics such as clinical trial design or the adequacy of their preclinical studies. FDA does accept foreign clinical data not conducted under an IND if the study was conducted in accordance with good clinical practice, GCP, and FDA is able to validate the data through an on-site inspection if needed. Here, GCP means a standard for the conduct, design, and reporting of clinical trials in a way that provides assurance that, again, the human subject's safety, rights, and well-being are protected, and in a way that provides assurance that the data are credible and accurate. GCP would also include informed consent and review by an independent ethics board, such as an IRB, before the studies begin. Some sponsors may even seek to rely solely on foreign clinical trial data in their applications. FDA regulations allow this to occur if certain conditions are met, and these are provided here on the slide towards the bottom. Overall, they stipulate that the foreign clinical trial data needs to be able to be extrapolated to the US population, and the sponsor needs to demonstrate that FDA standards for data quality and trial quality are met.
We talked a little bit earlier on about the 21st century cures mentality, and we want to dive in now to FDA's expedited programs. Kelly, can you lead us through what those options are?
Sure, thank you, Becky. So on the next slide, you will see that CBER and CDER utilize 5 different expedited programs: Fast Track, Priority Review, Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy, or RMAT designation, Accelerated Approval, and Breakthrough Therapy. And as you will see from the quotes from agency leadership towards the bottom of the slides, these programs are very popular among the industry, and they can help bring novel therapies to market more efficiently and quickly. The next slide provides an overview of these expedited programs. Starting from the bottom row, what benefits do these expedited programs convey? In general, FDA will take various actions to expedite the development and review of drugs, including providing intensive guidance on drug development, more frequent interactions with the agency, and these meetings and interactions beginning earlier on to assure that companies are collecting appropriate data to support their marketing application, streamlined clinical development requirements, such as the use of a surrogate endpoint or intermediate clinical endpoint for accelerated approval. For priority review, a shorter FDA review clock. So while standard applications, it will generally take FDA a year, 12 months, to issue a decision on the application. For priority review applications, that timeline will be reduced to 8 months. And lastly, rolling review, which means that rather than submitting the entire BLA or NDA at the same time, sponsors may submit components of the application on a rolling basis as they are done. And as for the eligibility criteria, as you can see from the qualifying criteria row, for all expedited programs in general, the drugs must address an unmet medical need in treatment of a serious condition. Here, a serious condition is a disease associated with morbidity that has a significant impact on day-to-day functioning. Diseases such as Alzheimer's, AIDS, and cancer are obvious examples, but diseases such as depression and diabetes may also be considered serious. For RMAT, I will just note that's the most recently created designation among the 5 under the 21st Century Cures Act that Becky touched upon earlier. And for that designation, in order to qualify, the drug has to be a regenerative medicine therapy. So in other words, cell therapies, certain gene therapies, and tissue engineering products. Overall, we recommend companies from early on in product development to see if their product candidates qualify for any of these programs and to consider how to make use of the benefits they offer. That way, when companies obtain or get these designations, they will be well positioned to move swiftly. We also recommend companies to communicate with FDA as early as possible about these designation requests. And there are also some important differences in the qualifying criteria and the benefits that these programs offer. So companies should take them into consideration when they apply. Lastly, companies may apply for more than 1 designation per drug. So there have been many products with 2, 3, or 4 expedited programs. On the next slide, you will see that given the benefits of these programs, it's not surprising that they are highly valued and used by companies. Among the 5 different expedited programs, Priority Review, Fast Track, and Breakthrough Therapy designation are the most frequently used. Last year in 2020, 68% of CDER's novel drug approvals were designated in one or more of these expedited review categories. These programs are also very popular among oncology products. So 90% of an initial oncology drug approvals have used an expedited program. These programs have also been shown to reduce the time it takes to develop a drug and get it approved. According to an article published in the Journal of American Medical Association, the clinical development timeline was significantly shortened for drugs with the breakthrough therapy designation. While the median development time for drugs without any expedited program was 8 years, that was streamlined to 4.8 for drugs with the designation. Before we move away from this topic, I do want to note that there have been recent discussions to redesign and simplify these programs. Both the agency and industry recognize that these programs are similar to one another and that there are redundancies in the benefits they offer. And because sponsors are required to apply for each designation separately, it can be time-consuming and resource-consuming for them to prepare multiple designation requests and also for the agency to review them. Proposals have been introduced to bundle these different programs into one single pathway, so please keep an eye out for potential changes.
It's a really good point. When I was at the agency, there were a lot of discussions about how to infuse all of these programs with new nimbleness in light of the directive from Congress in the 21st Century Cures Act. As you've shown, there's been some considerable success, and as the agency would tell you, it's not about jeopardizing the safety and efficacy review, but about having reviews that are more efficient and more streamlined with the same information more quickly. So very interesting. I want to move Catherine to really diving into pricing and reimbursement considerations. It's never too early for an innovator to start thinking about not only how they're going to achieve market approval from FDA, but how they're going to have their product priced and how they're going to get it paid for by various government actors. So very eager to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, such a critical issue because who is going to pay for your product and how much they're going to pay for your product is really critical to the success of the product. These issues are also very complicated and require attention, expertise, and resources to be adequately addressed in advance of product launch so that patients have appropriate access to a product once the FDA approves it. Many companies start thinking about these issues and staffing up for them 2 years before their anticipated launch date. And just to emphasize a little bit more, the reason why pricing and reimbursement are so important is because we're talking about key commercial issues. We are asking who is willing to purchase a product, how much are they willing to pay for it, and how many patients will ultimately receive access. When framed this way, it can sound very simple, but the process and the factors that influence these decision points are multi-layered and they're very complicated. One of the reasons why this is so complicated is that the distribution and payment model for prescription products is complex and involves a number of actors. As reflected on this slide, we show a very simple representation of a standard model, a standard distribution and payment model. And when we're talking about drug pricing, we're referring to the various measures used by different actors in the industry, including manufacturers, wholesalers, insurers, PBMs, Medicare and Medicaid, to represent the price of a prescription drug product at various points in the model. One really critical issue to keep in mind is that while manufacturers can determine how much to charge a wholesaler or hospital for its product, reimbursement is dictated by a very complex patchwork of regulations that indirectly dictate how much manufacturers can actually charge for their products. On the next slide, we need to acknowledge that in the United States, manufacturers are required to calculate and report to the government the prices at which they sell their products to certain purchasers. There are several metrics that must be calculated, each with its own complex formula and each tied to its own government program. These metrics are then used to determine the reimbursement available for a manufacturer's products under various government healthcare programs. This also influences the reimbursement available through private employer-sponsored insurance. In addition, under the Medicaid program, which is the government program for low-income individuals in the United States, manufacturers must pay rebates to the government for use of the company's products. The prices that the manufacturers offer in the commercial market can increase or decrease the size of their Medicaid rebates and ultimately have an impact on the company's bottom line. Again, companies must think carefully about all of their pricing arrangements and their impact on their Medicaid rebates. Finally, I'll note that in recent years, several states have adopted drug price transparency laws and similar laws. Many of these laws require manufacturers to report drug price increases, so it is important to keep these laws in mind at the time of product launch in the event that a company anticipates planned price increases over time. I'll also note that if a price increases too quickly, companies may be required to pay additional rebates under the Medicaid program, which can further impact a company's bottom line. All of these issues raise the question of how to prepare and how to balance this complex regulatory patchwork. A standard practice that most U.S. companies employ to monitor and govern a company-wide pricing strategy is through a pricing committee that has line of sight into what the company is doing across the board from a pricing perspective, and that also understands the complex regulatory framework that applies. Companies also need to have in place their systems to calculate and report government price reporting metrics. And they need to be prepared for these issues on day one of launch, because that's when their regulatory obligations begin to start. In addition, on the issue of timing, there are several related infrastructures that manufacturers start to build before launch so that patients can access their products right away. So, for example, on the next slide, we see that there are myriad commercial relationships to consider with payers, PBMs, group purchasing organizations, specialty pharmacies, wholesalers, physician offices, and institutional providers, among others. These relationships are important to ensuring that product is in the market at launch, and their commercial terms also have an impact on pricing and reimbursement. In addition, on the next slide, we look at the patient and reimbursement support offerings that are fairly standard for most companies in the United States. It may be the case that some patients still can't afford their prescription drug products despite the coverage that might be available, or perhaps healthcare providers don't fully understand the reimbursement framework for a specific product. This is why we see so many companies adopt robust patient and reimbursement support programs. All of these programs are built before launch. They require a fair amount of expertise and time to build, so it's critical that companies have in place the right resources and personnel to effectively manage these systems. The next slide shows a timeline at a glance, and based on our regular work we do at Sidley with emerging life science companies, I would just reiterate that most pre-commercial companies are thinking about these issues, staffing up, and talking to outside counsel at least 2 years in advance of the anticipated product approval date.
Well, thanks so much, Catherine, for walking us through those best practices. I want to turn back to Kelly now and talk about FDA exclusivity for marketing. A lot of people in the innovator space are very aware of their IP rights, their patent rights, but sometimes there's less familiarity with some of the potentially important protections for your portfolio that can come from FDA exclusivity. Kelly, can you walk us through what is exclusivity and what are the various varieties of that are potentially available to innovators?
Sure, thank you, Becky. As Becky mentioned, exclusivity can be a critical factor in the life cycle planning of drugs. Exclusivity in general refers to exclusive marketing or data rights granted by FDA generally upon product approval. And the intent here is to award and encourage development of new therapies. Having exclusivity would prevent the submission of ANDAs, abbreviated new drug applications, Section 505(b)(2) applications, and biosimilar applications. And there are a number of key regulatory exclusivities that are available for innovators. And some of them are listed here on this slide. On a very high level, the reference biological product exclusivity is available to novel biological products and will prevent a biosimilar application from being submitted for 4 years and from being approved as many as 12 years. The 5-year new chemical entity NCE exclusivity is available to novel active moieties or active ingredients and will prevent a generic drug company from relying upon data submitted by innovative companies for 5 years. The new clinical study exclusivity is granted to a drug when an application contains reports of new clinical trials that are essential for approval. FDA has granted this exclusivity for changes such as new dosage forms or new indications. The 7-year orphan drug exclusivity, which I will be going into a bit more detail, serves as a financial incentive to develop products to treat rare diseases. So these are diseases that affect less than 200,000 patients in the US. And lastly, the companies can receive pediatric exclusivity if they conduct and submit pediatric studies in response to a written request from the agency. This is a 6-month add-on to an existing patent term protection or a marketing exclusivity. On the next slide, you will see that orphan drug exclusivity is where we have recently seen some agency activity. Last year, FDA issued a draft guidance on how it evaluates gene therapy products for purposes of orphan drug exclusivity. I will unpack that a little bit here. The exclusivity blocks FDA from approving the same drug for the same disease or condition for 7 years from the date of approval. Note that it does not block approval of a different drug for the same disease or the approval of a same drug for different disease. So what does FDA mean by the same drug? Well, for long, FDA had not issued any guidance or regulations on how it would define it for gene therapy products. All we had was that for drugs composed of large molecules or macromolecules, same drug is a drug that contains the quote, same principal molecular structural features, but not necessarily all of the same structural features, end quote. As a result, there was speculation as to whether the agency would focus only on the transgene component of the gene therapy product, so the functional gene that gets introduced, or also the vector, the delivery vehicle, such as a virus or a plasmid. According to the guidance from last year, FDA will consider both the transgene and the vector to be principal molecular structural features. So for example, if 2 gene therapy products have different transgenes or vectors from different viral classes, such as a gamma retrovirus versus an adeno-associated virus, FDA will generally consider them to be different products for orphan drug exclusivity purposes. Lastly, CBER's guidance agenda reflects that this guidance may be finalized this year. And so we may see a final version in the near future.
Thanks, Kelly. Very important potential protections to keep in mind as you are navigating potential avenues for FDA approval and exclusivity. We want to finish by talking a bit about regulatory shifts due to COVID-19. And if you go to the next slide, we'll walk through some of this with you. So one of the questions that was very pressing when COVID started was, given FDA's proper focus on getting COVID therapies to market through these EUAs, for example, that we've talked about, what would happen to non-COVID workload at FDA? Well, it's actually a fairly good story in many respects, but there have been a number of challenges. So overall, FDA has maintained the timelines that are in what are called PDUFA agreements. These are agreements between Congress and industry and the agency about timelines for getting through applications. And FDA committed to, on the CDER side and the CBER side, trying to adhere to those timelines, notwithstanding the need to divert substantial resources and attention to COVID. Of course, the agency is aware that cancer, rare disease, other needed therapies don't go away just because of COVID. And the agency has a number of things in place that I think allowed it to accomplish this. One is that the agency was already doing work from home to some extent before COVID hit. So they were, as an institution, equipped to be able to make that transition more readily than perhaps some other entities were. And the statistics kind of bear that out. So for CDER, the drug center, they actually met their PDUFA goal date for all novel drug and biologic approvals last year in 2020, notwithstanding COVID. And they also approved, as you saw in the pie graph that we showed, or the bar graph that we showed early on, a near record 53 novel drugs in 2020. At the same time, there was definitely a palpable toll on FDA's non-COVID workload as a result of resources being put onto COVID. So CDER has met its goal date for about more than 90% of applications, but its on-time decision rate is trending downward to some extent. There have also been a number of difficulties, for example, in conducting pre-approval inspections. And so, we've been hearing anecdotally from clients and experiencing a number of circumstances where FDA was not able to get and inspect a facility before the date of the NDA or BLA. And the feeling was that that may have delayed the ability of the agency to go ahead and approve. We're seeing notions from the agency that they are trying to get boots back on the ground at these facilities to be able to be in a better position to inspect in a more regular order in the coming months. We actually did a client award not long ago because that, of course, puts considerable pressure on getting those inspections right, because if inspectors are able to get back in and take a look, if they find problems and you need to remedy them, those can be quite large tasks, and it may be quite some time longer than normal, maybe many months, even years before the agency can go back and do a new inspection. So very important to be prepared for inspection readiness when they're able to get there so that you're ready to go. And going forward, we're anticipating that the COVID-19 workload for FDA is going to remain heavy, particularly in the divisions within CBER and CDER that handle vaccines, antiviral, pulmonary, and critical care medicines, all of those sorts of areas that have been affected so disproportionately by COVID and the side effects of having that condition. More pandemic work could certainly be on the way. We have a number of late-stage trials that are expected to read out soon. And so as we talked about early on, you see the migration of these therapies and diagnostics going from an EUA setting to a more standard approval setting. One more thing I'll call out for you. Of course, the agency does a lot of its work through statutes and regs, but it also gives a lot of practical guidance that can be very helpful to reflect the agency's current thinking in what's called guidance documents. And the non-COVID guidance documents have really been backburnered in large measure during COVID, as the agency has pushed out really an extraordinary number of COVID-related guidance documents. So there's also probably less of that that's ever been available to us to see the agency's current thinking. So a return to updating and pushing through the agenda of guidance documents not related to COVID as we go forward. I want to focus in on one particularly important guidance document. If you were in the middle of clinical trials, early on it became clear that COVID could, of course, have implications for the ability to run clinical trials as planned. FDA recognized that the pandemic may impact, for example, clinical trials due to quarantines, site closures, travel limitations, supply chain interruptions, and COVID-19 infections. And so they put out some guidance to try to help sponsors navigate through how to address that. And this has been updated periodically through the time of COVID. And the guidance talks very explicitly about ensuring the safety of trial participants as being paramount. So for example, it signifies that there can be some flexibility in terms of making changes to a protocol or investigational plan in order to minimize and eliminate immediate hazards or to protect the life and well-being of the research participants in order to eliminate their exposure, to limit their exposure to COVID-19. And the agency has signaled pretty extraordinary flexibility in theory that those really critical changes could be implemented without IRB or independent ethics committee approval or before filing an amendment to the IND or IDE. Of course, any of those changes should be consistent with the protocol to the extent possible and should be fully documented with specific information about the relationship to COVID in the clinical study report. It bears in mind that just because FDA has signaled this sort of extraordinary flexibility to mirror extraordinary times, it doesn't mean that you should routinely do that. You should still think very hard about whether or not you should get IRB approval and submit these supplements before implementing the changes. But this does allow some flexibility for really extraordinary problems due to COVID. And as we'll see on the next slide, there is considerable question about the ramifications of that flexibility for drug trial programs. So there's a lack of clarity about how changes in clinical trials due to COVID will impact the submission and review of new drug applications and biologic license applications. What will FDA do if there's missing data because of COVID? If there's fewer subjects, if the data is perhaps less reliable, are they still going to accept delayed submissions? And what about changes to a protocol? Lots of questions and really very little guidance, but please continue watching because that's a critically important question as the agency tries to put out very practical advice to try to help people navigate COVID and stay on track to approving novel therapies, but without diminution of the agency's very important safety and efficacy requirements. So lots of changes, and we are incredibly grateful to you for joining us. I am very pleased to have been joined by my colleagues, Catherine Starks and Kelly Cho. We hope this was interesting and informative, and we would be delighted to hear from you if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you so much.